maybe we should give the audience the chance to throw in some questions for you. We have 2 mics here. If people who might be interested in asking questions could line up there, and if it's okay with the panel, maybe we'll take 3 or 4 questions and then come back and whoever wants to respond to them. You might have to turn it on, or maybe someone can help you. There's also a mic on that side, by the way.
Maybe I can, yeah.
You're on. You're on now.
You were on.
I'd like to thank Ron
And also introduce yourself for those of you, those who.
My name is Donald Thea from the Center for Global Health and Development here at Boston University. I'd like to thank Ron and Jerry for bringing together such a wonderful panel. Dr. Altman, what you said before, in quoting Dr. Osler 70, 80 years ago, really resonated with me. And it seems to me that the American public probably still believes what Dr. Osler was saying. The Economist has just declared that we've entered into a post-factual political era. And to a certain extent, I think the same thing could be true of science. And my question to the panel is, how do we as scientists and communicators deal with the rising epidemic of scientific truthiness, whether it's the anti-vaxxers or Dr. Oz, or all of the information that's being promulgated that we know is just patently false. It's extremely frustrating. How do we do a better job of fighting that epidemic?
Hold your thoughts on that. We'll take 2 or 3 questions more, please. Let's take the next one from that side.
I'm actually down here, just
yes.
short. My name is Jacqueline Miller. I'm from Education Development Center in Waltham, Massachusetts. And I'd like to address the theme of communicating with the public and extend on something Lawrence Altman started to discuss. One of the most effective ways to develop a scientifically literate, engaged, and informed public is to begin early in the schools. And so my question for the panel is, are any of your organizations addressing the challenge of bringing robust and 21st century science education, which would be emerging diseases, synthetic biology, stem cell therapies, in any significant and serious ways to the primary and secondary schools in this country?
Excellent.
Hi everyone, I'm Benjamin Thompson from the Microbiology Society in the UK. My question actually is about commitment, which is a word that came up a few times here. If we look into the future and we think about maybe control or eradication of these diseases as they become established, what can we do to make sure we get the commitment from governments and funders for the kind of the last few percent? I mean, what lessons can we learn from maybe polio, where the last 1% of eradication has been incredibly difficult, both in terms of funding and sociologically as well? What can we do to stamp these things out in the end? Thanks.
Thank you. Let's take just one more from that side.
I'm Erica Sapphire from the Scripps Research Institute. So the public's understanding of emerging viruses comes from outbreak and contagion, and we've seen this storyline over again. Monkey in the forest bites a hunter, hunter goes to town, whole global map turns red. And that creates panic, and maybe what we need is a different screenplay or a different way to tell the virus story. From your perspective, what is that screenplay that you would like to see that we can use as a tool for communicating with the public?
Okay, you have a wonderful array of questions, from thinking about scientific truthiness to what good school education in sciences would look like if it tackled the type of things you want to tackle. How do you get that last 2%, last 3% either of money or of commitment or of societal change? And finally, if you have a screen script ready to replace contagion. Anyone? Anyone on any one of those?
I'll take something to answer all 4 at once. Is the post-factual world did impact the last percent of polio, in that a very small set of communities decided that it was a threat to their children, and then it spread through their migrations over a short period of time, and then we had to bring it back down. So that was, if we had been able to educate early and often. That would have helped, potentially. And I think that one way to do that is via screenplays, not the bad ones, but the better ones. And I've been inspired by an organization, pged.org, that actually works with both congressional briefings, but also with Hollywood, and also the National Academy of Sciences as Hollywood Health and Society. And they work on trying to get not only the accuracy higher, getting back to David's accuracy with precision, but to get them more relevant to getting that last percent or getting at that post-factual narrative.
David?
I'd like to add to that and say something again on that last question of the screenplay. I'd like to distinguish between Hollywood and Hollywood and make the point that whatever objections we all may have to a movie like Outbreak, where, for instance, as we know, the role of the African monkey was played by a South American monkey, and accuracy went downward from there. Still, I think it's important to recognize that that was not a problem with Contagion. And I'm not saying this just because Ian Lipkin is standing at the microphone. It's true that that was a movie, whether you like that movie or not, in which the science was very carefully and I believe accurately presented. So there's Hollywood and there's Hollywood.
Thank you. Yes?
In terms of the end game for polio, I think that's an area where there's a good rational discourse and education, and we have to make that case frequently. But certainly if you look at the playing out the billions that would have to be allocated for the ongoing prevention of resurgence if you didn't eliminate polio, is a very good economic argument which can be made. There are other infections out there, like sleeping sickness, where we are down to the last 4,000 to 5,000 cases in the world. And these are in some of the most desperate areas in central part of Africa, where that same argument doesn't actually apply. And that is a much more challenging issue in terms of how do you deal with the end game for sleeping sickness versus polio.
Thank you. Anyone else? And I really don't want to lose the question on the curriculum in schools. So we all agree that schools aren't preparing young people with the information that they need, with the ideas that they need. But what would they need to do for you to be more satisfied than you are? Maybe start with Lawrence.
I was going to come back, if I can not evade your question, but come back to something that was asked in the beginning on the public and sections of the public that don't want vaccines and react.
Truthiness.
I'm going to pose that question and throw it back to the scientific community, because the bulk of the information that the public receives from the scientific community and medicine and so forth come from professional journals. And I think the professional journals are journalism. And if you don't agree with that, you're going to have to defend the use of the word journal in the majority of the publications that are published around the world in the scientific measure. But the journals don't see themselves in that regard. They have a tremendous economic motivation. They're cash cows for their owners. They practice scoop journalism. The information has to come out in the journals first or in conjunction with a meeting, but they're controlling the information. And as a result, people hear one thing on 1 week, 3 weeks later, something contradictory because they're coming out from different journals. But it comes back to Osler. People begin to distrust this because you're hearing so much of what the information in the journals is sloppy or wrong and so forth. And the scientific community hasn't wanted to address that issue, and it's been around for a long time. And the business of peer review is jargon. It's scientific jargon that the rest of the world knows as vetting. And there's nothing magic about scientific peer review. So I can see where the public is confused about this, and that just sets off the triggers for some of the people who have ideas that we don't agree with. But I think the scientific community has got to address what the net effect is of the misinformation when it occurs, and it's not every day, but when it occurs in the science journalism field, which comes from the professional journals. And believe me, lay journalism makes its mistakes too. I'm not making this a we they, but it's made to a we they because you have to have the information in the journals before it's presented to the public. That's been the credo from the scientific editors.
Thank you. Anyone on, I don't want to lose the lady's question on the curriculum.
But science is really not emphasized as much as it should be in our school system, for sure. I mean, there's no doubt about that. We continue to try and promote STEM in programs that we have. The NIH is not the primary organization to promote education of science in school, because that's not what we do. But we don't really have a very strong push for that. And I think that's something that we as a nation need to look at more carefully. And if we did have a more scientifically sophisticated presentation of the science in school as people got out of, I mean, really, school, very early on in school, people would have a different ability to evaluate the validity of certain scientific statements. So I think we're not doing a very good job as a nation of doing that.
And probably even worse globally. And it would seem that in cases like polio, where these ideas get set in even very minor proportions of populations, that can halt major movements.
But you see, but I think, I'm sorry, I think that education, I learned this because I've had a deal of, I would say for better or worse, mostly for worse, with the vaxxers, the people who are against vaccinations, because every time they do that, when you testify before the Congress, you got to explain to the congressman that the mercury in vaccines are not causing mental retardation. There are a group of individuals who are against vaccines, and there's a proportion that by educating them, you can change their mind. But there's no doubt a proportion of the anti-vaccine people, no matter what scientific data you put in front of them, you will not change their mind. So when you're talking about the polio thing, I think the people who are against polio, to convince them that giving their children polio vaccine is not going to sterilize them and it's a plot of the Western world against them, I don't think any amount of education in the world is going to change their mind.
Can I just want to chime in on that, though. It also bears saying that part of the equation was decision by, the U.S. government as a way to find bin Laden, to, it wasn't to basically use as cover, medical work.
But the Nigerian pulling back
I'm
of
not saying
vaccines
that it was,
antedated.
I'm not saying that it's the only reason, but I'm saying that we should acknowledge that it certainly didn't help.
No, it certainly didn't help, but that wasn't the reason that Nigeria pulled out.
Sure.
And I'm very glad for that conversation, because in many ways it again shows the complexity of these issues. It's not simply a question of having the dollars and the solution. These are tough political, cultural, social, deeply entrenched historical changes that one is very often. One thinks of what a great revolution it was when we in the West discovered that bathing was actually a good idea. And how many good things happened because of that. So sometimes the big changes do come from breaking those cultural barriers that have to do with these things. But let's take another round. Yes, sir.
Hi, George Gao. I'm from Beijing, China. On the list of participants, I'm from the Chinese Academy of Sciences, where I have a lab doing some basic research. Also, I'm the Deputy Director General of China CDC for research and communicable diseases. So congratulations for the BU, and thank you for inviting me to be here. I think it's very important. Here, we brought such an important question here. Look at the title, Emerging Challenges, Opportunities. We also have some, I tried to use Tony's word, we have the established challenges always there. So as I understand, I think 20 mentioned about the borders, no visas needed for any infectious diseases. I came here with, visa. US visa, very difficult for Chinese to get. Anyway, I got it. And David mentioned that once spillover for more than 30,000 cases, almost over 11,000 deaths for the last outbreak of Ebola. I think Trevor mentioned Gates Foundation for so many years. Only when we had this Ebola, you start to really care about this. You start to think about emerging viruses. And George mentioned something about technologies and surveillance. We always have these technologies and surveillance. Technology is there in terms of the controlling of the spillover or the viruses. And that Naresh and mentioned something about the big story. So I think we are looking for something. When we only have the tiny story, how can we cover from the journals and newspapers? I think Larry also mentioned something about the government contribution. Government for the medical care, medical education, medical research. But that ideal, you mentioned about you come to the global. So we are talking about global. Emerging infectious disease, always global. It's not China's issue, it's not the US issue, not Europe, it's global. Now, so what's the opportunities we have here? We always have these opportunities. But the technologies and the surveillance are always there. Why couldn't we do things really better? As I understand, at the moment, we are talking about establishing African CDC. And how can we do that? When you mentioned about global, Tony mentioned something about the WHO. So many people, when you think about the role WHO played during the Ebola outbreak, I think we have some convergence. So my question would go for all the panelists. So what's your opinion from your field can we do to stop the next spillover or emerging viruses, or at least the surveillance? I think maybe we can have a very big African CDC, but maybe that's really not practical. We can't do, you cannot cover the whole continent. But how can we cover some important niche and really do something, from your field? I think really the opportunity there. What's the opportunity here?
Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Anatol Krediger from WIPO, the World Intellectual Property Organization. We are a neighbor of WHO. My question is going in the same direction on global governance. And I think this panel here, having NIH's experience, Tony's enthusiasm and commitment, the Gates Foundation's ability to bang heads together and get things done, and then I think also the press's very important role in shaping public opinion in order to get policy responses. Comes to the following, I would like to quote Peter Hotez. Much of the world's neglected diseases are actually in wealthy countries, G20 countries and Nigeria. They have more than 50% of the burden of neglected diseases, many of which are, of course, infectious. So looking at a purely pragmatic perspective, it's in the interest of the rich countries to do something about it. It's the burden that he refers to, it's the human burden, the DALIs. But in terms of the economic burden, it's much, much bigger, in fact, in the rich countries. Again, self-serving interest to do something about it. I've been for 6 years in one of the UN agencies. I believe more than ever before of the crucial importance of multilateral institutions. However, I've also learned the limitations. They cannot be the leaders because we have 188 member states and they make policies. It's not us who make policy, but our member states. So that complexity does not allow us or the UN system, the specialized agencies, to be leaders. We need new institutions. My question to you is, what is being done in terms of new governance? And if it's not done, what should be done?
Thank you. Brief question?
It's actually not a question, it's a comment. Is that
as
okay?
long as it's brief.
So it has to do with persuading people that what we're doing, whether it's vaccines or diagnostics or surveillance, is important. We have representatives of the Times and the Post and NPR. Very few people are willing to deal with the Oz Show or Fox. So we're not reaching within the United States the population that is most eager to understand what we have to say. The other thing I would say is, and when I go on these shows, people tell me that they talk to other scientists and they don't want to go on Oz. They don't want to get in the ring with Bill O'Reilly. And you have to know what you're doing before you get in with Bill O'Reilly, because he is wily. But nonetheless, you can have an impact. And I thank you very much for your kind comments about Contagion. We did the best we could, but as the producer said, you have to keep butts in seats or nobody's going to watch the movie. The other thing that's very important, I think, is you all have kids, or many of you have kids. Go and talk to high schools. You can have an enormous impact by talking to school children, which was something that was mentioned by someone up there. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank
We'll
you.
take the last one for this round.
Let me start by thanking Boston University and the organizers for the opportunity for this conference, and especially Jerry Koch. My name is Ayuade Udbola. I'm from the University of Ibadan, Nigeria. The presentations from all the speakers are fantastic, and I take from it the money has increased tremendously. The science has increased tremendously. We still have the problem, and my question to the panel is, what do we need to do about the third leg of the tripod? The boots on the ground, the capacity for those who live with the disease in Africa, Latin America, and Asia to participate in using the science in preventing or detecting these things before they become problems. I'm raising this question because I've seen a few of the opportunities where the boots on the ground have made a big difference. The late John Lamontagne with Dr. Fauci and Jerry Koch, Carlos Morel, put together a program some 17 years ago on multilateral initiative on malaria in Africa with Lou Miller. The main objective of that initiative was to train and build capacity of Africans to answer questions on malaria. They did a fantastic job, and the numbers of deaths from malaria today would have been worse than what it is without that ability. I also have the opportunity, because some of you opened your doors for my own training here some 30 years ago, and I'm back in Nigeria using that expertise. As we look to the future on global health, this third leg, what would this panel recommend as a way to challenge it and to bring it to be useful in using the sciences and the money? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Four very excellent thoughts. How do we capture opportunity before crisis? The big challenge of global governance, we can agree it doesn't work, but if we need to make it work, how? The very important idea of which media are we just narrowing our readership of those who are interested in the serious discussion and leaving out very many who are not, by not working with them. And finally, this really important idea of the frontline operators in countries around the world and how to get that, that good science and that available money in a way that their work can become more prolific and productive. Any of those questions? Any of the panel?
Related to the comment around surveillance and opportunities from the China CDC, and a little bit to the capacity issue over here. So we had been, and maybe David's question as well, around the utilization for the chronic diseases of this investment in pandemics. We and many others had been talking about the huge data gap in terms of understanding what's going on with many infectious diseases in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance. And we've been working with other partners in terms of how to improve that, very slowly, making slow progress. With the pandemics coming along over there, there's a huge sudden surge of interest in having better surveillance. And to the extent that it was difficult to enlist people to participate in this, now people are jumping up and down wanting to participate in this from a pandemic surveillance perspective. Now, surveillance actually has the utility that it obviously has to be done in the impacted countries. So there's a tremendous amount of infrastructure that can be invested in these countries around epidemiology, clinical studies, clinical trial networks that can be done around the subject of surveillance.
Anyone else? Any of the questions?
To follow up on what Trevor said, but also to answer the question, over the last several years, the gentleman was referring to work that we did many years ago in West Africa, particularly in Mali, and developing a training and research center in Mali, that right now the trend is and should continue that whenever any research or any activities are done by one country in another country, in a developing country, that you need to leave behind some sustainable infrastructure. You can't just go in and not do it. And that is almost has to be a rule. But that's not going to solve the problem completely, because the host countries themselves have to make more of a commitment to build and sustain their own infrastructure, because often when you go in and train people and create an infrastructure and then the host country doesn't support it anymore and it disappears. So it's got to be a combination of when you do something in another country, you have a commitment to leave some sort of sustainable infrastructure there, as well as having the host countries continue with that infrastructure. And that'll play into what Trevor was saying about surveillance. I mean, you have much better surveillance if you have an infrastructure to do the surveillance.
Anyone wants to take that global governance question of global governance?
Can I ask a related question to our panel that I'm
Sure.
curious about? I mean, you know, as you were saying, I mean, you know, in an ideal world, everyone pays their dues and WHO is fully funded, but it's been a while that it hasn't been working, and you know, even Ebola hasn't. You'd think that that would finally mobilize a solution, and clearly it hasn't. And I'm just wondering, you know, there seems to be more and more, you just read these editorials and ideas of people who are like essentially saying, you know what, the reality is there's just a limit to how much we can make that work, and let's come up with workarounds, you know, alternate ways. I'm just curious, do you realistically, do you see that as sort of the way that it's developing, where the answer to these, you know, ideas of having a fund that can be drawn on, or a global health force that can be, you know, deployed quickly, that more and more the talk is of some way to do it that isn't really the WHO and not about fixing the WHO.
And maybe also what those alternatives might be.
Yeah, there are things that you might have to work around the WHO, but I don't think we should get rid of the WHO. I really think that, as Larry said, and I agree with him, that there is a need for a WHO, because when you're dealing with something that involves so many different countries, you're going to need one organization that's going to be speaking for them. But we will have to create I wouldn't say workarounds, I would say complementing what the WHO does. And one of those is that fund that I was saying. If you really do want to have a situation where you can fund vaccines, develop them quickly, you may not be able to go through the WHO system, but that doesn't mean you should get rid of the WHO. The WHO will always have its place. We need to complement and supplement what they do. And we can't just expect them to do everything. And that's why when I said that I thought they dropped the ball, I didn't mean that as a disrespect at all. I'm saying they didn't have the capabilities of doing what they would have liked to have done.
Tony, and you know that you've been working with this vaccine fund, and that was launched a couple of weeks ago.
Yes, yes.
Not in opposition to the WHO, but very much them being part of the ecosystem, and they have the regulatory part of that actually to take care of.
Exactly.
There's also the human nature aspect of a global organization and the countries, and if outbreak occurs in one country and that country doesn't want to recognize it or doesn't want in what it would regard as intrusion from a foreign medical army or science army, we don't have to go any farther than the United States. CDC has zero authority to go into any state or any area in the state without the invitation of that state. I remember being at a meeting where a senator from Pennsylvania was just astounded to learn that fact. And yet that senator was looking over a lot of funding. Yes, there are ways that CDC finds its way to get into states in outbreaks, but there are times when the local community doesn't want a CDC coming in. So extrapolate from that to the world, you can easily see where countries may not want any form of a WHO, whatever you call it, or whatever fund it has, to come in and usurp its authority. Again, it comes back to education and informing the public and of what the consequences are.
You know, a fascinating related point to that, the way that we have everything, you know, kind of divided up among states was during the Ebola outbreak, the fact that each state was essentially coming up with its own policy for how returning health workers were treated really affected the ability of, you know, American healthcare workers to be part of the response. And it was truly devolved down to the states, and it was such a patchwork quilt. It was, I mean, I remember trying to put it together. It was incredibly complicated to figure out who had what rules.
But I would say that in terms of testing the openness of states to have other parties come in, a crisis is the worst time to test that. That's why you need to put the infrastructures in place during the non-crisis times so that you can utilize them in a crisis.
Dr. Chich?
Let me just give an unorthodox answer to the governance question, which is we do have an international organization that permeates through all these societies, which is the internet. And we have things like microfinancing and social networks for radical social change, or small and radical social change, that could completely outflank what we might think is the most direct way of making changes in local or international governance. So we should keep in mind the grassroots power of globalization via the internet.
And I should, someone who works on institutions, not necessarily health institutions, but international institutions. WHO is not the sum of the global governance system of international health, and it's a lot of nonprofits, it's funders, it's linkages between national institutions, and it's a complex and growing web. In fact, in recent decades, it's grown tremendously in influence. But one question that is left, it wasn't a question, it was a comment, but I wanted to see maybe if David had something to say about that, was about the other media. I don't think he used the term, but the implications seem to be that we have nice coverage in quote-unquote elite media, talking to audiences already.
I agree very much with what Ian said about that it's important to get beyond whatever we might think of as elite media or liberal media. I mean, I write for National Geographic, and I think of that as a pretty democratic thing. You could find it you find it in any dental waiting room in America. So when you have your teeth checked next time, you know, check out an article on Ebola and in the search for its reservoir, or whatever. My limited experience with organizations like Fox has been very mixed, but some of it actually was good. I've been on Fox, on the news side of Fox, and they have let me talk about some of the ideas that I talked about this afternoon about zoonotic diseases. I've also had my experience with Rush Limbaugh, not with Bill Riley, and that was not positive. But in principle, it's very important, yes, for us not to just be speaking to the people who already agree with us that these things are important and these ideas are okay, but to talk to other people, even if we have to wrap it in sugar, if we have to embed it in entertainment as best we can, whatever. Yes, it's important to speak to people who are not dialed into the elite liberal media. And some of them, as I think it was Tony said, you will never change their minds about something like vaccination. You won't even change their minds about whether their children should ever be exposed to the name Darwin, which is where our science education problems begin, or at least one of the places. But still, it's important, hugely important, to try and broaden the audience.
This hasn't come up, but before I open for the last set of questions, if I can throw in one just simply because I'm surprised it hasn't come up. Bioterrorism, germ warfare. Are these distractions? Are these overrated? Are these underestimated? How do you react to this topic bringing up those words? Any of you?
No, I think the best thing that happened to the field of naturally occurring, emerging, and re-emerging infections was the fear of bioterrorism. Because when the rather large infusion of money to the NIH came in 2002, actually, but it was in the 2003 budget, I had very intensive negotiations with President Bush, and I convinced him, to his credit, that although the money should be enhancing our capability to respond to the select agents of smallpox, tularemia, botulism, the hemorrhagic fevers, and anthrax, in reality, the worst bioterrorist was nature. And that allowed us to put investments not only in the specific organisms, but to build the capabilities of being able to respond to what is almost certainly overwhelmingly more likely to harm mankind is naturally occurring than bioterror. And I think that, I don't think it's a distraction. I think it was something that focused our attention on the fact that microbes emerge and reemerge. And President George W. Bush recognized that, and President Obama understands and recognizes that, and whenever he talks about preparedness, he talks about both naturally occurring and deliberately released. So I think it's been a good thing for the community.
Thanks.
We've talked a lot about surveillance, and the surveillance system in the United States, which probably is the leading one in the world, owes 100% of its origin to bioterrorism. It was the Korean War and the fear of bioterrorism in the Korean Peninsula War that led Congress to give the money to set up what became the Epidemic Intelligence Service, which is the core of CDC. And I think without that threat, from what I was able to learn during my time there and from history, we probably wouldn't have that kind of surveillance system in the United States, or something else would have had to come along to do it. But historically, that's how we got the surveillance system and CDC.
Thank you. Let's take a last round of questions. Again, my request would be to keep them short so that we can have a set of answers here.
Hi, I'm Emily Speranza. I'm a current PhD student, actually doing my work in the NEIDL. And one area of media that I don't think anyone's really covered yet is social media. You know, millennials, we get most of our news from people like John Oliver and from Facebook and BuzzFeed and Huffington Post. And a lot of that is like, causes a lot of misinformation because it's passed down through so many sources.
Not John Oliver.
Yeah, they're not journalism, but that's where people get their information from, and I often find myself having to, explain to my friends, no, you don't need to be worried about Ebola, you're not likely to get it, even though, BuzzFeed says it's in the US, we're all gonna die. How do you think we can better, communicate, especially to the social media age?
Thank you.
Yes, hello. My name is Rafaela Squiloni. I'm a Blavatnik Fellow in Life Science Entrepreneurship at Harvard Business School. And my plan is to focus my fellowship on emerging infectious diseases precisely because of my love and fascinations with some of these pathogens, thanks to books such as Spillover. So despite the current large population across Central and South America and Puerto Rico that have been infected by either Zika, dengue, or chikungunya, or a combination of the three, there has been limited access to Zika reagents for research. Originally, Brazil didn't want to share its reagents, and other than gaining access through BI Resources, ATCC, or one of the two private companies for patient samples, it appears as though most researchers and drug diagnostic developers are using the same reagents. This is not ideal, especially in the face of a virus that we know very little of, a virus that may be evolving and mutating, and a virus that has strong cross-reactivity and antibody-dependent enhancement with dengue. So this concept really falls in the category of how important it is to create links to these regions and of thinking contextually on how to actually create access to FDA-approved diagnostics and drugs. So, for example, there were several diagnostics that received an FDA emergency use authorization for Ebola, but very few made it to the region. So I'd just like to get the thoughts of the panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
My name is Richard Cash. I'm from the Harvard School of Public Health and focus on infectious diseases. A brief comment. I think, though I understand the focus on the scientific development, almost all of the outbreaks that I'm aware of have a very, very, very strong human component, whether it's the Ebola outbreak and the not attention to burial practices and so on. And I think that the social sciences need to have a much greater a voice in this. One example of that, of course, is that any surveillance system is only going to function as well as people report. If people don't report because they're being stigmatized, whether it's the building of the Panama Canal or the early days of the AIDS epidemic or Ebola or Zika or anything else, you're not going to get good information. How do we remove the issues of stigmatization that affect people economically, socially, and otherwise? Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take a question from both of you on that side and wrap this. Yes.
I'm Anna Myers, and I'm not sure if I'm tall enough for this microphone. So I was actually also going to ask about bioterror-related things. But the way you were all talking about it, it was a very like, oh, this was in the past. Like, we're very grateful because, you know, there were these threats and now we got funding. But what do you think the current risk of, you know, bioterror from various agents is? And are we prepared? If there is a smallpox release in the US, for example, would we be prepared?
Thank you. Last question.
My name is Sherwood Gorback from Tufts. I was a student in the 1960s at the London School of Tropical Medicine, and the discussion in the hallways was the near eradication of malaria, if you can believe that, because of mosquito control, insecticides, and other environmental measures. Well, that has all gone by, and now we've had an increase in malaria, increase in resistance, and there has been also a dearth of malariologists. We've lost a whole generation of malariologists. So the two biggest funders of the malaria program, our representatives are sitting there, both from the environmental side and also from the vaccine side. And I wonder if you could give us any hope for the vaccine, which I know there was a paper published just recently about the new vaccine, but it seems we're a distance away from still controlling this ancient disease. Thank you.
Thank you. Once again, 5 excellent questions. Social media. How do we get real meaningful links to regions? Something that has been asked similarly before also. The role of social sciences and dealing with the stigma that sometimes becomes a barrier, especially in those earlier days. And coming back to bioterrorism, including are we prepared for anything in the future? And finally, malaria, is there hope? Anyone?
So on the social media front, I would say, you know, engage, really engage. But the two, I mean, for better and for worse, you know, sort of old-fashioned news organizations versus social media are really interlinked. I mean, it's fascinating. At NPR, for example, we have a dashboard on our computers that show us, the traffic. We obviously have a listening audience, but there's also an online readership. And it'll show us, how many people have been reading the online version of your story. And you can see where the traffic has been coming from. And no sooner is it posted on NPR's Facebook page, then the traffic starts spiking, and that's often how. And some stories will just catch on like wildfire, and it essentially just propagates through Facebook, and it's really individuals liking your story and sharing it with their friends, and then and just certain stories resonate, and they'll do incredibly well in terms of the traffic, and that's people who are on Facebook, recommending a piece to their friends. So you can actually, obviously engage in social media, but you can also take, mainstream media pieces that you think warrant attention and use social media to amplify their audience.
Maybe on the malaria. So in terms of malaria vaccines, there is some hope over there in terms of the vaccine that has been studied quite broadly in Africa, the RTSS vaccine, because that did demonstrate that you could have an effective vaccine against malaria. Unfortunately, the level of efficacy was not that high for that vaccine, so it's unlikely to be the solution. Has opened up a number of new options for malaria. But what it has pointed to is that we really need better tools to block transmission, to deal with that path between the vector and the next person infected. And the excitement over there in that transmission blocking area is really around what George had talked about earlier in terms of a gene drive and whether one really has some new options to actually modify these vectors in a way whereby they'll not be able to transmit malaria, which might have the same kind of impact as a vaccine.
So smallpox is you never want to poo-poo a threat, but if there's any potential bioterror agent that we are likely best prepared for smallpox, after the anthrax attack, when I was briefing the White House about potential agents of bioterrorism, President Bush turned around and just asked me, he says, well, what about smallpox? And I said, well, smallpox, we have a vaccine. He said, well, how many doses of smallpox vaccine do we have? And I said, we have 18 million doses. And he said, we have 350 million people in this country. That's a little low. So we went on a big crash program. We showed that you could dilute it 1 to 5 and even 1 to 10. So our 15 million doses went to 75 million doses. Then a company that was storing about another 50 million gave it to us. And then we contracted with another company to make it from a different way, from a cell base. So now we have a few 100 million doses of smallpox in our strategic national stockpile. Now, the reason that is something that makes us think that smallpox, although it's always a threat, is not going to be a knockout threat, for the simple reason that smallpox is one of the few infections that once you get exposed, vaccine actually works for a considerable period of time after you get exposed. So if I get exposed to smallpox now and 3 days later I get the smallpox vaccine, I'm protected against smallpox. And we know from the work of Bill Foege and the work of D.A. Henderson that you can do ring vaccination, so that if there is an outbreak that's a terror outbreak, it very likely would be able to be controlled by a ring vaccination program. Now, I say that, I don't want to be quoted saying I'm not worried about smallpox, because then I could see the next headline, Fauci not worried about smallpox. But the fact is we take smallpox very seriously, but we do have a countermeasure against it in significant supply. Helen was raising her hand, right?
In the U.S.
Yeah.
I know, and that's great, but
Yeah.
there's a lot more people in the world than just in the U.S.
Yeah. No, for sure, but he was talking about bioterrorism for us. Are we going to, I mean, I don't think that any single country is going to be able to protect the entire world against a bioterror attack. Yeah.
Anyone else on any of these questions? David?
Just one thought added to the subject of eradication, the hope of eradication or the dream of eradication of malaria, smallpox, polio. I suppose this is obvious, but I'm reminded that these are not any more zoonoses. And it's much harder to come to grips with the question of eradicating a disease if it is still in present time a zoonotic disease, because you've got the reservoir host, and are you going to go out and eradicate that entire species of monkeys, or that cluster of species of monkeys, or that species of rodent? It raises some thorny questions about just how much eradicating we have the right to do.
Thank you very much. This has been just a fascinating and amazingly insightful discussion. Before I end, I have a one-word question maybe that everyone can help me with here. One of the most reassuring thoughts today was David reminding us very emphatically that we are smarter. And I take personal pride in hearing that from him. But also then Anthony showing us that graph about the historical graph, right? With the blip and then going down. So here is a very quick one-word answer maybe from each of you. 10 years later, and Jerry and Ron are already planning the 10th anniversary of NEIDL conference. When we gather here again and you come and put the updated graph, what might that line look between now and then? Flat, down, up. What would be your best guess? David.
I saw a little bit of a gentle rise near the end of that line, and I'm not sure what that represents, whether that represents Ebola or malaria or whatever. I would hope that the line stays very flat and low. I'm not optimistic about a lot of things, but I'm optimistic about that.
Down. I can give you an explanation, but down.
We like the tone of that. We like the tone of that. That's where we want that line to go.
All the lines are going down except potentially HIV/AIDS.
Yeah, I think dramatically down, because we're going to get better at surveillance and getting ahead. Even for zoonotic diseases, we're going to be able to read out the diseases that are going through animals before they even cross over.
I mean, I'm naturally an optimist, so I would hope down. I will say the thing that keeps me up at night is the idea of that little spike with the influenza, that there not be another, freak influenza mutation.
So you think it will be what?
I mean, I'm going to say down just because
Okay.
it's the world I want to live in. But I do. I mean, you saw that spike, and that is that's a concern that it not include sort of down, and then freak spike.
Yes, sir.
I think it would be down with the same provision that we never know if influenza is going to do what it did in 1918, 1919, but we have better vaccine today than the non-existent one then. But I would also say that we're going to still see more and more new viruses, new microbes that we haven't seen before. They're going to be discovered. That doesn't necessarily translate into outbreaks, but I would be surprised if any of us thought that we're not going to find more. And who knows what will happen with the ones that we find in all the interchanges in society that we have. I don't mean that as a negative, I'm just meaning that's what surveillance is for and what you are on the outlook for.
Thank you so much. I did not think that I would find my dose of optimism in a crowd of eminent journalists and people who work on infectious disease. It is a great sign for the future of the world that we have a 6-0 answer on that one. Thank you, everyone. Please join me in thanking a wonderful panel.